Marcus Webb's hands never stopped moving that night. As Vietnamese voices crackled through his radio headset, his fingers were soaked with sweat. Leaning against the muddy wall of Firebase Ripcord's bunker, he scratched words into the notebook, balanced on his knee. Mortar rounds exploded outside, but he focused only on those voices. Every word intercepted from enemy radio traffic was a clue to the next assault. 23 days had passed since the siege began. 23 God-forsaken days. Firebase Ripcord had been under siege. The North Vietnamese army had them surrounded from every direction. Each night, they crept closer. Each morning a few more friends were missing. Webb tried not to think about it. He just listened to the radio, because that radio was their only chance of survival. Private First Class Marcus Webb came from a small town in Ohio. He was 19 years old. When he left, his mother had told him he always loved listening to the radio, and maybe he would work with radios in the army too. Now here he was, in the middle of Vietnam. But the radios he listened to did not play music. They broadcast death orders. Being a signals intelligence specialist seemed safer than fighting on the front lines. But at Firebase Ripcord, there was no safe place. The base sat on top of a hill in the middle of the A Shao Valley. Enemy forces surrounded them completely. Every night, mortar and rocket attacks began. Every day helicopters tried to come in, but most had to turn back. Enemy air defense was too strong and too precise. Webb's job was deceptively simple. Listen to enemy radio communications. Translate them, report to the commander, but that simple job meant saving lives. Every word he translated could warn them of an attack in advance. Or it could not, because the Vietnamese knew this too. Sometimes they fed false information over the airwaves. Sometimes they went silent for hours. Sometimes, though, they made mistakes. That night was different, and Webb felt it in his bones. Radio traffic was unusually quiet, far less communication than normal patterns suggested, as if enemy forces were waiting for something, holding their breath before a final strike. Webb pressed his headset tighter against his ears. He swept through frequencies one by one, methodically checking each channel. Something was going to happen. Something had to happen. The silence itself was a message. It was 23:47 hours when he heard it. A sudden voice cut through the static. Clear, distinct. A powerful signal that made him sit up straight. A commander was speaking with authority. His voice was calm and measured. He was giving orders with the confidence of someone who knew his men would obey without question. Webb immediately began taking notes, his hand moving across the page in frantic scribbles. His heart pounded against his ribs. This was important. Very important. This could be the intelligence they needed. The commander was giving deployment orders to his units with military precision. 2nd Battalion was ordered to take position on the north slope. 3rd Battalion was directed to control the southern pass. Webb's hands trembled as he translated, trying to capture every nuance. This was clearly a coordinated assault plan. It could be tomorrow morning at first light, or even tonight under cover of darkness. But then the commander said something else that made no tactical sense, and Webb's heart stopped beating for just a moment. The Americans would withdraw tomorrow. Webb dropped his pen, and it rolled into the mud at his feet. How could the enemy commander possibly know this? The withdrawal order had not even been given yet through official channels. No military radio traffic had mentioned this possibility. Their own commanders had only started discussing the potential withdrawal in the last 12 hours, and even then, in heavily coded language. How did the North Vietnamese find out? Did they have a spy inside the firebase? Was there a leak somewhere up the command chain? But the truly shocking part had not come yet. The Vietnamese commander continued speaking, and his voice had changed subtly. It was softer now, more contemplative, as if he was thinking carefully about his next words, weighing them against his conscience. And then he said something that would haunt Marcus Webb for the next 45 years of his life. They would let the Americans go. Webb forgot to breathe for several seconds. He pulled off his radio headset with shaking hands. Put it back on quickly, adjusting the fit. Had he heard wrong? Had his exhausted mind fabricated those words? Impossible. His Vietnamese was not perfect, but those words were unmistakable. The commander was telling his units they would allow the Americans to withdraw without firing a shot. Why would any enemy commander issue such an order? Why would he let them go when he had them surrounded and vulnerable? Maybe it was an elaborate trap. Maybe they knew Webb was listening at this very moment. Maybe they were trying to mislead him into a false sense of security. But there was something in the tone of that voice that did not sound deceptive. A wariness that seemed genuine. Not surrender, but something else. Something that almost sounded like compassion or mercy. Webb could not fully understand it, could not process what it might mean. He immediately jumped up from his position in the bunker. He sank into the mud outside but did not care about his boots or his uniform. He ran toward the command tent as fast as his legs would carry him. Bullets whistled past his ear from sporadic sniper fire, but he just kept running with his head low. He had to relay this information immediately to Captain Reeves. This could change everything. This could save every man on this firebase. When he reached the tent, he was completely out of breath. Gasping. Captain Reeves stood over the operations map, with two other officers. He looked at Webb with tired, bloodshot eyes that had seen too much death. The captain asked what the urgency was. Webb showed him his notes with trembling hands. Breathlessly, he explained what he had intercepted. He translated what the enemy commander had said, word for word. He carefully conveyed every detail, every nuance of tone he had detected. Reeves listened without interruption, his face illuminated by the single lantern hanging in the tent, but his expression did not change at all. He just shook his head slowly when Webb finished. Reeves told him flatly it was a trap. Webb wanted to object, wanted to argue his case, but how could he? How do you explain the tone of a voice to a superior officer? How do you report a feeling, an instinct? Webb tried anyway, telling his captain that the man's voice seemed different, seemed sincere. Reeves cut him off. His voice was hard and practical. He asked Webb if he thought the enemy felt sorry for them. He reminded Webb this was war, not a gentleman's agreement. The enemy makes you comfortable and then strikes when your guard drops. It was the oldest tactic in the book, dating back thousands of years. They knew Americans were monitoring their radio frequencies. They were letting Webb hear exactly what they wanted him to hear. It was psychological warfare, nothing more. Webb fell silent, unable to formulate a counterargument. Maybe Reeves was right after all. Maybe he was just too tired to think clearly. He had not slept properly in 23 days. Maybe his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him, hearing things that were not there or misinterpreting things that were. But he could not forget the tone of that voice, could not shake the feeling. There was a determination in that Vietnamese commander's voice. He had made a decision that went against military logic, and that decision was to let the Americans go without a fight. Webb could not sleep that night despite his overwhelming exhaustion. He sat by the radio in his bunker, hunched over the equipment. He listened to the same frequency for hours, barely moving. Maybe that commander would speak again. Maybe more information would come through that would confirm or deny what he had heard. But there was only silence and occasional static. Only routine reports from soldiers checking in with their units could be heard. Generic communications. That commander's distinctive voice never came back on the air. It was as if he had vanished into the night. At 0600 hours, the official withdrawal order finally came down the chain of command. Firebase Ripcord would be evacuated completely. Helicopters were already on the way from Da Nang. All personnel should prepare for immediate extraction. When word spread throughout the base, the 300 men stationed there felt a strange mix of joy and fear. They were going home, finally leaving this hellish hilltop. But first they had to get out of here alive. And while leaving, they would be completely exposed to enemy fire from the surrounding jungle. The helicopters would be slow, vulnerable targets. Webb gathered his equipment mechanically, going through the motions. He shouldered his radio set one last time. He put his notebook carefully in his pocket, making sure it was secure. Those notes might be useful someday, he thought. Maybe someone would believe him eventually. Or maybe they were just the scribblings of a crazy soldier who had cracked under pressure. He honestly did not know anymore. The helicopters started arriving in waves as the sun rose higher. The sound of rotor blades filled the air. The first group of men loaded up and took off, heading south. No fire was opened from the jungle. Not a single shot. The second group took off minutes later. Silence again, eerie and unsettling. Webb was assigned to the third group. As he boarded the Huey helicopter, he looked around at the surrounding terrain with intense focus. The forests on the hills were completely still. There was no movement anywhere. No muzzle flashes, no rocket trails. It was as if enemy forces had simply vanished overnight, melted back into the jungle. The helicopter lifted off and Webb looked down through the open door. Firebase Ripcord was shrinking below them, becoming smaller. The place where those 23 terrible days had passed was being left behind forever. But that Vietnamese commander's voice was still in his mind, still echoing. Who could he be? What was his name? Why had he let them go when victory was within his grasp? And most importantly, had he really done it? Or had Webb misunderstood everything in his exhausted state? The flight back to the main base took 45 minutes over the jungle. Webb stared out the window the entire time, watching the endless green canopy below. Somewhere down there, that commander was probably still giving orders to his men, or maybe he was resting in some hidden bunker. Maybe he was thinking about the war and its cost. Maybe he was thinking about the Americans he had let escape, wondering if he had made the right choice. When they landed at the base, Webb was processed like everyone else returning from Firebase Ripcord. Debriefing with intelligence officers, medical check for injuries and parasites, equipment returned to supply. He mentioned the radio intercept again during his debriefing session, explaining everything in detail. The intelligence officer took notes dutifully in his folder, but his face showed clear skepticism. The officer told Webb they would add it to the report and thanked him for his diligent monitoring of enemy frequencies. But Webb knew the truth just from looking at the man's eyes. They did not believe him at all. His report would go into a file somewhere in some archive. Maybe someone would read it years later when documents were declassified. Maybe not. The war was full of strange moments that nobody could explain or verify. Unexplained events that got lost in the chaos. This would just be one more anomaly, one more unverified claim from an exhausted soldier. Webb returned to his unit and tried to move forward. Life went on despite everything. More missions, more radio intercepts, more sleepless nights listening to enemy chatter. But he never heard that commander's voice again, despite searching for it constantly. He checked every frequency every night, hoping to catch that distinctive tone. But it was gone completely, as if that moment had never happened, as if he had imagined the entire thing. 3 months later, Webb's tour of duty ended, and his rotation home came through. He flew back to the United States on a transport plane full of soldiers, back to Ohio and everything familiar, back to his mother's house where he had grown up. She hugged him at the airport and cried tears of relief and joy. She kept saying he was home. He was finally home safe. But Webb did not feel home at all. Part of him was still at Firebase Ripcord, still listening to that voice in the darkness. He tried his best to forget and move on with his life. He got a job at a local radio station, which was ironic given everything. He married a girl he had known in high school before the war. They had 2 children over the years. Life moved forward as it always does, but at night sometimes he would wake up in a cold sweat hearing that voice. The words echoed in his dreams. They would let the Americans go. What did it really mean? Why did it haunt him so persistently? Years passed, and then decades. Webb grew older, and his hair turned gray. His children grew up and had children of their own. Vietnam became history, something in textbooks. The war ended in 1975, with Saigon's fall. The soldiers came home, or they did not. The country tried desperately to move on and forget. But for those who had been there in the jungle, the war never really ended. It lived in their dreams, their memories, their quiet moments alone. Webb kept his notebook from Firebase Ripcord all those years. He never threw it away despite moving several times. Sometimes he would open it late at night and read those notes from that specific night in 1970. His handwriting was shaky and desperate on the page. The words were there, clear as day, undeniable proof. But nobody else had heard that voice. Nobody else could confirm what happened. Maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe his mind had broken just a little bit that night. In 2015, Marcus Webb was 74 years old and fully retired. He was living in Florida with his wife in a modest house. His children visited on holidays and brought the grandchildren. Life was quiet and peaceful. Good, even better than he deserved. But that voice still echoed sometimes in his head when he was alone. One ordinary day, he received an unexpected email that changed everything. It was from a documentary film crew based in New York. They explained they were making a film about Firebase Ripcord and the siege. They had found his name in recently declassified intelligence reports from the National Archives. They wanted to interview him about his experiences there. Would he be willing to talk on camera about what happened? Webb hesitated for several days before responding. He had not talked about the war in years. Not in any real detail. Not really. His family knew he had served in Vietnam, but he never gave specifics about what he did or saw. What was there to say that would make sense to people who were not there? That he had sat in a bunker and listened to radios while men died around him? That he had heard a voice that may or may not have saved their lives? It sounded absurd even to him. But something made him say yes. Eventually. Maybe it was his age, and the knowledge that time was running out. Maybe it was curiosity about what they had discovered. Maybe it was that voice, still nagging at him, after all these years, demanding resolution. He agreed to meet the film crew and do the interview. They came to his house in Florida on a warm afternoon. A producer, a director, a cameraman, young people, far too young to remember Vietnam firsthand. They set up their equipment efficiently in his living room. They asked him questions from a prepared list. He answered as best he could. He told them about Firebase Ripcord in general terms, about the siege and the conditions, about the radio intercepts and his role. And then, almost hesitantly, he told them about that specific night, about the commander's voice coming through his headset, about the words that had haunted him for 45 years. About how nobody believed him then. The producer listened very carefully, leaning forward. She took detailed notes, and then she said something that made Webb's blood run cold in his veins. She told him they believed they knew who that commander was. Webb stared at her in shock. Unable to speak, she opened her laptop computer and turned it toward him. She showed him a photograph on the screen. It was an old military photo, grainy and faded with age. A North Vietnamese army officer in full uniform. His face was weathered and serious. His eyes looked tired and old beyond his years. The producer explained this was Colonel Nguyen Van Tu. He had commanded NVA forces in the A Shao Valley throughout 1970. They had interviewed him just last month in Hanoi for the documentary. He was 89 years old now. When they mentioned Firebase Ripcord during the interview, he became very quiet and emotional. And then he told them something extraordinary. Webb could not speak or move. He just stared at the photograph on the screen. Could this really be him? Could this be the man whose voice had saved 300 American lives? The producer continued explaining what Colonel Nguyen had told them. She said that on the night before the American withdrawal, he made a command decision. He told his officers explicitly not to fire on the helicopters during evacuation. He said the siege had gone on long enough already. Too many men had died on both sides for a single firebase. The Americans were leaving Vietnam anyway. There was no point in killing more people needlessly when the outcome was already determined. Webb felt tears welling up in his eyes for the first time in decades. After 45 years of wondering and doubt, here was the answer. Here was the truth he had sought. That voice had been completely real. That decision had been real. One enemy commander, tired of death and killing, had chosen mercy over military victory. Webb's voice cracked when he asked if Colonel Nguyen knew someone was listening that night. The producer smiled gently at him. She said they had asked the colonel that exact question. He said he did not know for certain if anyone was monitoring that frequency, but he hoped someone was listening. He said he spoke clearly and directly that night, specifically in case any American signals intelligence operator might intercept his words. He wanted them to know the decision. He wanted them to believe they would be safe during withdrawal. Webb put his face in his hands and wept openly. His wife came over and held him while he cried. The film crew respectfully turned off their cameras and gave him privacy. They let him have this moment of release after carrying the burden for so long. When he finally composed himself, Webb looked at the photograph on the laptop again. Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu, the man who had saved his life and the lives of his brothers, the man whose voice had echoed in his mind for decades. He was real. He had a name and a face. He was alive, and he had done it all intentionally and deliberately. Webb asked hesitantly if he could possibly meet the colonel in person. The producer nodded and said Colonel Nguyen had specifically said he would welcome such a meeting. If any American who was at Firebase Ripcord that day wanted to meet him, he would be honored to sit down with them. 3 months later, Marcus Webb flew to Vietnam for the first time since 1970. It was his first return in 45 years. The country had changed completely and was almost unrecognizable. Where there had been war and destruction, there was now peace and prosperity. Where there had been jungle bases and firebase, there were now modern cities with skyscrapers. But some things remained exactly the same. The oppressive heat, the thick humidity, the brilliant green of the jungle. The film crew arranged a private meeting in Hanoi at a quiet park. They deliberately chose a location away from cameras and public attention. They wanted the two men to have complete privacy for this moment. Webb walked slowly through the park, his heart pounding in his chest. What would he say? What could anyone say to a man who had been his enemy, but had saved his life? He saw the colonel sitting alone on a bench under a tree, an old man thin and frail with age, but with that same serious face from the photograph. Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu looked up as Webb approached on the path. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment 45 years dissolved into nothing. Webb sat down next to him on the bench. Neither spoke at first. What words could possibly bridge the gap between them? Between the war and the peace? Between the young soldiers they had been and the old men they had become? Finally, Colonel Nguyen spoke first. His English was broken and heavily accented, but understandable. He asked if Webb had been there at Firebase Ripcord. Webb nodded and told him he was the radio operator. He said he heard the colonel's voice that night coming through his headset. The colonel closed his eyes as if remembering. He said quietly that he hoped someone had heard. He hoped someone would understand what he was trying to do. Webb asked the question he had carried for 45 years like a weight. He asked why the colonel did it. Why did he let them go? Colonel Nguyen was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. He said he was tired that night, tired of war and killing, tired of death on both sides. He had lost so many of his own men at that firebase over those weeks. The Americans had lost so many. And for what purpose? His side would win the war eventually, or the Americans would leave eventually. Either way, more death would not change the final outcome. He paused for a moment, then continued speaking. He said he thought about his own son that night. His son was fighting somewhere in the South. He thought about American fathers and American sons. They were all just men following orders from distant capitals. That night he decided he would not follow his orders blindly. He would follow his heart and his conscience instead. Webb felt tears flowing down his face again. He told the colonel that his decision saved 300 lives that day. The colonel replied softly that maybe he saved his own soul as well. The war took so much from all of them, from both sides. He wanted to give something back, even if it was to his enemy, even if nobody ever knew. They sat together in silence for a long time. Two old warriors who had once been enemies, now just two men who had survived. The film crew watched from a respectful distance, their cameras off and packed away. This moment was not for the documentary. This moment was sacred and private. Before they parted, Colonel Nguyen reached into his pocket slowly. He pulled out a small, worn photograph that had been carried for decades. It showed a young Vietnamese soldier, smiling and full of life. The colonel said this was his son. He died in 1972, 2 years after Firebase Ripcord. He never came home. Webb looked at the photograph of a young man he had never known. Then he reached into his own wallet. He pulled out a faded picture of his platoon at Firebase Ripcord taken before the siege. Young American faces, smiling despite everything. He pointed to one face and said this was his best friend. He died there on that hill. He never made it to the helicopters. The two old men looked at the photographs together. Sons and friends lost to a war that accomplished nothing. Lives cut short for politics and ideology. They understood each other in that moment more than words could ever express. When they finally stood to leave, they embraced briefly, two old soldiers who had tried to kill each other once, now holding each other. Webb thanked the colonel for his mercy. The colonel thanked Webb for remembering, for bearing witness. As Webb walked away from that park in Hanoi, he felt something lift from his shoulders. A weight he had carried for 45 years was finally gone. That voice in his head was quiet now, at peace. He had his answer. He knew the truth, and knowing changed everything. The documentary was released a year later. It told the story of Firebase Ripcord in the siege. It included Webb's interview and Colonel Nguyen's interview. It showed their meeting in the park. When it aired, thousands of veterans watched. Many of them cried. Many of them understood what Webb had experienced. The not knowing, the wondering, the weight of unanswered questions. Marcus Webb died in 2019, at the age of 78. He passed peacefully, in his sleep with his family around him. At his funeral, his children found his old notebook from Vietnam in his belongings. They read the notes from that night in 1970, the shaky handwriting, the desperate translations, and they finally understood what their father had carried all those years. The notebook now sits in the National Vietnam War Museum. Next to it is a letter from Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu, written shortly before his own death in 2017. In the letter, he explains his decision that night. He writes about war and peace, about enemies and brothers, about the choices that define us. Visitors to the museum stop and read both items. They see the connection between two men separated by war, brought together by mercy. They understand that in the midst of violence, humanity can still prevail, that in the darkest moments, light can break through. Firebase Ripcord was officially abandoned on July 23, 1970. The hill where it stood has long since been reclaimed by jungle. No trace remains of the bunkers or the fighting. Nature has erased the scars, but the story lives on in the memories of those who were there. And in the documents they left behind, a testimony to the strange, powerful moments that happen in war. Moments that nobody plans for, that nobody expects, that change everything. Marcus Webb spent 45 years wondering if he imagined that voice, wondering if his exhausted mind had created a fantasy to cope with the trauma. But it was real. The voice was real. The mercy was real. And in the end, that reality was more powerful than any fiction could ever be.